Um, well, thanks so much for inviting me. It's really good to be here. I'm really glad to be able to come here. I've not been in Glasgow for a few years, actually. My brother-in-law did Cornhill, Scotland, some years ago, and I think has kind of strong Glasgow roots. His grandfather was the curator of Kelvin Grove or something, so Glasgow's intellectual royalty or something, I don't know. But anyway, I think you know Kelly, don't you? It's all right, I think, yeah. But good. Now, I thought it'd be quite useful. One of the things with Proverbs is that it's a book that I hope you found fun to read. It's a book that people find quite hard to teach, especially they find it hard to preach. And so what I thought we'd do in the course of the day is kind of, I'd try not to kind of run away from the challenge. And I thought, let's try to kind of intersperse the day with some expositions from the book of Proverbs, along doing the kind of the more nitty-gritty hard work of getting into the book as a whole. And so I thought we'd do that now. So maybe if you could turn to Proverbs chapter 1, and we'll start with a little devotion. And then just to prepare you, I'm going to encourage you to turn to your neighbor and pray at the end of this. So hopefully that's okay. If you want to move seats, it's too late now. Good. Proverbs chapter 1. And I want to start with the question, why should we want to be wise? Why should we want to be wise? You might think, well, that's obvious. Of course we want to be wise. Who would choose to be a fool? And yet the world is full of people who don't really try, isn't it? I was speaking to the late Mike Ovey, the principal of Oak Hill Theological College a few years ago, and we're talking about a famous theologian. And I had just said in this conversation that the problem with this particular theologian was that for all of his obvious and very great gifts, he just wasn't very responsible. And Mike Ovey replied to me and said, well, that's the problem with my generation. We just haven't grown up. It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it, to say about an entire generation, and Mike was a baby boomer, an entire generation, that it's a generation of babies. We find ourselves living in a deeply foolish culture. Foolish for the most basic Proverbs reason, its refusal to fear the Lord Jesus Christ. And foolish for the final Proverbs reason, that it's wise in its own eyes. And wisdom is undervalued amongst church leaders. Just imagine a job description that you're looking for, or think about training. You want great teachers, or pioneers, or slick talkers, or fast thinkers. But we're slow to notice whether people are wise. Perhaps we're not wise enough to be able to tell. And of course, wisdom's hard work. At the very least, it's hard work spiritually. Wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. It more or less ends with the resolve not to be wise in your own sight. And of course, both of those things require a posture of repentance. In Proverbs chapter 2 and chapter 3 and chapter 4 and chapter 8, wisdom is presented as a treasure that's of equivalent value as gold and silver and jewels. In other words, it's not just precious, but it is dearly bought. If you've ever ventured beyond Proverbs chapter 9 in your Bible reading, you'll know that it requires, even just to understand the sentence Proverbs in chapters 10 and following, requires a real mental sweat. But to do them, it's so much easier to be a fool, to be sounding off, boasting, prejudging, misrepresenting, rushing in and raging. Those things come easily, but wisdom is hard. Once you know Proverbs, you'll realize that understanding this book is the least of your problems. Actually being wise, that's where the rubber hits the road. So why should we want to be wise? We'll look down to Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 20. Wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the market she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy street she cries out. At the entrance of the city gate she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? If you turn at my reproof, behold, I'll pour out my spirit to you. I'll make my words known to you. Because I've called and you refuse to listen, have stretched out my hand and no one has heeded. Because you've ignored all my counsel and would have none of my reproof, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call upon me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me, because they hated knowledge and didn't choose the fear of the Lord, would have none of my counsel and despised all my reproof. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way and have their fill of their own devices. For the simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. But whoever listens to me will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread of disaster. It's wisdom's first great speech in the book of Proverbs. It forms a contrast with the call of the gang in chapter 1, verses 8 through 19. And at first glance, it looks like a matter of two ways to live, doesn't it? Verse 22. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? If you turn at my reproof, behold, I'll pour out my spirit to you. I'll make my words known to you. Because I've called and you've not listened, you refused. I've stretched my hand and no one has heeded. And then she carries on. You get the addressees, the simple, the foolish, the scoffers, a motley crew that combines the foolish and the simple, the faithless and the silly. And then there's the promise in verse 23. If you turn at my reproof, behold, I'll pour out my spirit upon you and make my words known to you. This extraordinary new covenant-like promise that wisdom will give you her spirit, put her words in your hearts. And then there's the threat of verse 24. Because I called and you refused, I will mock, I will laugh. Verse 26. And you might think, okay, well, this is two ways to live. It's the choice that we all face. You can either listen to wisdom or not, and the consequences will follow. But the truth is that this opening speech is wildly off balance. Look again, verse 24. Because I have called and you refuse to listen, have stretched out my hand and no one has heeded. Because you've ignored all my counsel and would have none of my reproof, I also will laugh at your calamity. I'll mock when terror strikes you. When terror strikes you like a storm and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, then they'll call upon me, but I won't answer. They'll seek me diligently, but will not find me, because they hated knowledge and didn't choose the fear of the Lord, would have none of my counsel and despised my reproof. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their way and have their fill of their own devices. For the simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. It's quite shocking, isn't it? Did you hear how wisdom talks? I will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when terror strikes you. There's real relish there. Terror, the storm, the whirlwind, and no way back, verse 28. Then they'll call upon me, but I will not answer. They'll seek me diligently, but will not find me. It's cruel, isn't it? Wisdom sounds cruel. She sounds like the Lord Jesus. The rains came down, and the floods came up, and the house on the sand fell flat, and great was the fall of it. And why should you want to be wise? Well, you'll regret it if you're not. From one angle, that's the whole message of the book of Proverbs. Wisdom comes in different flavors in this book. There's a kind of wisdom that's basically about basic orientation, the ability to choose between the Lord and idols, faithfulness and adultery, the fear of the Lord and the foreign women. There's the kind of wisdom that refuses to countenance violence and wickedness as a tool for getting things done. People have had a lot to say about that in the last couple of years. And then there's the subtler kind, the kind that knows when to speak and when to hold your tongue, the kind that understands people and motivations and situations truly, the kind that protects you from doing something truly stupid. Wisdom comes in different flavors. It's all here. But the reason you want wisdom is because of what's at stake if you don't have it. In other words, Proverbs is a book that's all about how not to wreck the kingdom. Proverbs is a book that's all about how not to wreck your life. Proverbs is a book about how not to wreck your ministry. Because when the rain comes down and the floods go up and it all comes crashing down, you'll regret it. And so let's decide together at the start of this morning that even though it comes at a very high price, a price that many, most perhaps, are unwilling to pay, even though it's out of fashion and it's going to require humility and hard work, wisdom is something that we really want. Verse 22, how long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? If you turn at my reproof, behold, I'll pour out my spirit to you. I will make my words known to you. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we do want to pray so much that you would give us a heart and an appetite and a desire to be wise, to fear you, to know you, to walk in your paths, to know your ways, to understand a word and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles, to have your spirit poured out in our hearts and to see things truly and rightly. And please would we long to be wise. And we pray that even having this day together today would help us to grow in wisdom. And we ask it in the name of the Lord Jesus. Amen. Why don't we turn to the person next to us and just spend a minute praying with them, and then we'll make a start. Over to you. Great. Well, let me interrupt there. Good. Okay. Now, it's really cool to be able to study Proverbs together today. I'm afraid that I have a bit of a habit of biting off more than other people are willing to chew, and I expect that's going to happen today. And it's kind of inevitable with the book of Proverbs, because there's a lot to chew in the book. But the basic plan over the course of the day is we're going to try to sort of get a bit of a sense of the book as a whole, and what the purpose is and how it fits together. Some of the things that I have to say are more kind of my own work than others, and so you'll work out which bits you want to disregard and kind of come up with your own thoughts instead. And I basically thought that for these kind of 4 sessions, we could start by thinking a bit about who Proverbs is addressing, who it's for, and therefore kind of what the book as a whole is offering. Then we could sort of think about, I guess you all know that it's teaching something to do with wisdom, what sort of wisdom the book of Proverbs is teaching, and then we'll have some lunch. And then we'll think about how it teaches, so how the book of Proverbs actually works, and sort of how the genre sort of helps to do that. And then we'll think about the conclusion at the end, chapters 30 and 31. So that's kind of the plan for the day up front. And along the way, I've got a couple more little moments of exposition to share with you as we go, and we'll see. There's been a plausible number of notepads here. It's because the expositions are spread across different things. But there you go. It's not because I like color coding. Anyway, I thought we could begin by maybe just having a little chat. So just turn to a neighbor, just think, well, what have you heard about the book of Proverbs? And what do you know about it? What kind of a book is it? Have you read it recently? I imagine you all read it this morning before you came. If you did, what did you especially enjoy? What makes Proverbs a difficult book to read? What makes it hard to teach? Over to you. Yeah. Okay, let me cut in there. Now, how's this going to work? Are we a brave group? Are we kind of ready to? Yeah, good. Okay. So, any thoughts on either things that you particularly enjoy about Proverbs or things that might make it particularly tricky? Any thoughts? It seems fragmented. Yeah, like, from chapter 10 onwards, it's like, what's his name? Which Vine is it that does the one-liners? Tim. It's a Tim Vine kind of comedy show, isn't it? It's all sort of one-line catchphrase things. That's right. Yeah, okay, good. Other things? Don't be shy. Great. Okay, so it's boring. It's got one thing to say. Chapter 31. Well, yeah, that's right. So chapter 31, we love to teach chapter 31, and probably in a slightly discouraging way. Is that right? As in, like, be this person and, like, feel bad about the fact you're not. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, yeah, good. Other thoughts? Yes, go on. So you enjoyed that? That's not a hard thing. That's like, it's cool that wisdom is this kind of creative power that God, by his wisdom, made the world, and that's on offer to you. Yeah, great. Yes, go on. Yeah, that's fun, isn't it? And actually, it's interesting. In some places, the book of the Bible that Bible translators have chosen to translate first, or sort of in the first few books they translate, is Proverbs. I mean, you might think surprising, but not completely unusual for people to think, oh, this really resonates with our culture, and let's kind of translate Proverbs and get people reading this in their own language. Okay, other thoughts? Yeah, that's right. So there's bits of Proverbs that are very shouty. That's right. And there's other bits that are much less so. But yeah, that's right. These moments when you have these great speeches addressing us. Yeah. Any other things? Any other things about what makes it tricky, do you think, or difficult? Yeah, go on. Yeah, okay, good. So we might feel nervous that this is a prosperity gospel book, and people who are prosperity gospel quite like it, because it seems to be offering, if you do the right thing, things are going to go well with you. Yeah, good. Okay, I mean, we'll want to come back to that. Any other things? One more thought about what makes it tricky. Yeah. Yes, yeah. Yeah, great. Good. Okay, now, Proverbs is a bit of an underappreciated book. And there's kind of schools of thought out there that it's not a specially wise book. So you have this from a few different angles. And one angle is people like to talk about wisdom literature as a genre. Now, listen, cards on the table. I'm really sorry if this is out of step with what you all know, but I don't really believe in wisdom literature. I know that somewhere a fairy probably just died, but I don't really believe in wisdom literature, as I don't really think it's a thing in the Bible. I'm so sorry. But people do, and so they talk about the wisdom books. And what they classically mean by that is Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job, those three. Actually, that's a 19th century invention, so nobody grouped those three as a set of three until a German liberal in the 1800s. And the reason he did it, like most things that German liberals did, was quite nefarious. He basically thought that most of the Old Testament was much too Jewish. As a German liberal writing in the 19th century, much too Jewish and much too caught up with things like the history of Israel and sacrifices. But thank goodness, there is this kind of minority report in the Old Testament, these much more philosophical, Western, pro-Aryan books, namely Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, the wisdom literature. Great, we can read those. Now, you probably don't want to be associated with that kind of scholarship, and I don't. But it really caught on. So it's like his kind of racism didn't, but the idea that Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes were a set really caught on. And it's become quite a thing to study these three as just being in a conversation with each other. You might have seen the Bible Project video, some of you, about this, where it pictures them as three friends. So kind of Proverbs is this like kind of, a super cool, stylish, quite young woman who's very smart but turns out a bit dumb. And then Ecclesiastes is kind of this slightly cynical, wizened old guy, and Job is someone who's really been through the mill. And they're kind of having a chat in a bar. And basically, Ecclesiastes and Job are kind of telling Proverbs that, for all of her sort of smart thinking, she hasn't really understood the world properly, and they're kind of correcting it. And so you imagine that Ecclesiastes and Job are in the Bible to correct Proverbs. You know what I'm sort of talking about? And of course, the trouble is that if you think that, then you're basically saying Proverbs is not that wise. Like, that it's a book that needs correction. It needs Ecclesiastes and Job to sit her down and tell her what to really think. And then I've got some friends who make a really big deal of Proverbs chapter 30. When you get to Proverbs chapter 30, there is this kind of cry of despair. We'll come to it later on today. I've not learned wisdom or the fear of the Holy One. And you get to the end. And people sort of say, well, maybe that's this clue that the whole book of Proverbs has been this kind of quest for wisdom. But then when we get to chapter 30, it turns out that it's all been a failure. And we've not really found it, as it turns out. And then there's a book written by Bill Hybels a few years ago called Axiom. And basically it was kind of taking lots of leadership tips from Proverbs. But I guess the whole principle, again, is that these are kind of just lots of hacks, as like, hacks for leadership as you're going through. And it's kind of helpful, but in a slightly sort of, everyday sort of a way. And so we can think of Proverbs as being a not especially wise book, which feels odd given the way it starts. At the same time, it's underappreciated because it's not a very easy book. Now, it's not easy to read, and we've already said this, that the first 9 chapters, it's great. You're going through these in quiet time, you're like, yeah, I've got this, it's really clear, I'm listening, I'm on board, and you have these nice long, chapter long poems as you're going through. And then you hit chapter 10, and you hit what I guess I'd describe as the wall, where from chapter 10, verse 1 through to 22:16, you have, I think it's 375 consecutive one-line proverbs. And they're in no apparent order at first glance. They're just kind of coming at you thick and fast in all sorts of directions. And they're about all sorts of things. And probably the best you can hope for in your quiet time, if you're reading a chapter of Proverbs, is that you kind of ask the what stood out to you question, and you pick one or two, and you kind of think about it. And if you're a particularly reflective type, you might write the one that stood out to you the most and stick it in your shirt pocket and look at it a couple of times in the day. And if you're not, let's face it, you forget about Proverbs and spend the rest of your time thinking about the chapter from John that you were reading instead. It's not easy, is it? And it's not easy to preach. So it's not easy if you're going to preach Proverbs chapter 1, fine. I'd preach that all day. Proverbs chapter 7, great, love it. If you set Proverbs chapter 14, it's not easy to kind of stand up and to give an expository sermon on a thing that seems to be pointing in a whole bunch of different directions. Well, the aim for this first session is to get clear on kind of who Proverbs is for, and to help us to see that that means it's for us. And I want us to start in Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 to 7. So let me read those verses. Very famous prologue to the book. We'll dive in. So the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealings, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, it's a helpful thing to have an opening to a book like that, isn't it? It kind of gives you a little purpose statement for the book of Proverbs as a whole. It tells you what the book's for. And I guess right off the bat, it gives you kind of a sense of an agenda. Verse 2, that this is about knowing wisdom, instruction, and understanding. Verse 3, it's about receiving instruction in wise dealing. Again, verse 4, it's about giving prudence and knowledge and discretion. Verse 5, it's about increasing in learning and obtaining guidance. Verse 6 is about understanding. And then, of course, verse 7, we're told what the beginning of understanding is. You can't kind of miss it, can you? As in, like, in all kinds of different words and lots of synonyms, this is a book that wants to instruct you and to teach you and to make you wise. That's the aim of this book as you start out. And there's a clear starting point for that, verse 7, which we'll want to circle back to. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And so whatever you want with understanding, you're going to want to start with trusting and knowing the Lord's. And a clear context as well. Verse 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Verse 3, to give instruction in wise dealing in righteousness, justice, and equity. Again, we're going to want to think about this a bit more as the morning goes on. But again, you can't get away from the way the book starts with the fact that this wisdom curriculum has something to do with kings and with rule, as in righteousness, justice, and equity. And that little threefold thing is a sort of an Israelite way of talking about the art of government or something like that, what judges do. And these are the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel, right up front. Something about rule and wisdom and kings. And then here's the interesting thing that you might never have thought about before, a clear method. Look at verse 2. To know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight. Or verse 6, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. Now, one of the things we find tricky about the book of Proverbs is that it's written in Proverbs. And it's kind of on the tin, and that's very helpful. But we find that hard work, and we don't really enjoy Proverbs very much. We kind of want to decode them the whole time, so we want to turn Proverbs into like rules of thumb or into like bullet points. We'd prefer it if it's written in bullet points. And then the bits of Proverbs that aren't written in Proverbs are written in poems. And I don't know whether, I mean, maybe in Scotland you're more poetic than in London. I mean, like, you know, perhaps your kind of Celtic souls or something save you from the problems of the southeast of England. I think the primary word I'd use to describe the students at Cornhill in London when they encounter biblical poetry is panic. I'd say as soon as you say something's in poetry, they start saying all sorts of implausible things. It's like, people are really daft when it comes to poetry. So you sort of imagine I don't know, here's the prophet Isaiah in poetry. He stood there with like, I don't know, like a cocktail glass in one hand, a cigarette and a cigarette holder in the other, wearing a beret and kind of going, like, smoke, smog, chimneys, Glasgow. Okay, that's the kind of thing we're doing, right? And like, you know, it becomes basically impenetrable. And nothing's been written in a poem that wouldn't be said better in sort of long-form journalism. Nothing's been written in a poem that wouldn't... The reason that the Bible's in poetry is to make it harder for people like you. And so even the bits of Proverbs that aren't in Proverbs, so the bits of, I mean, let's forget about Proverbs. And he meant to use bullet points, but sadly hadn't found that function on Word, so he accidentally put it in Proverbs. And then there's the rest of Proverbs that's written in poems, because the Bible hates you, and it's trying to make it impenetrable. And yet, look at this, verse 2, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand, did you see this? Words of insight. And verse 6, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. Now, I wonder whether you've ever thought about this, but Proverbs seems to think that being good with words, and by words I mean like poems and proverbs, and being good with riddles and with the words of the wise and sayings, that might actually teach you to understand how to be a king better, or to know how to lead, or to understand people better. Wow, I mean, like, you know, I'm so sorry if you're a mathematician, but it turns out that the Bible wasn't written as equations. Something about words might help you. Okay, we're going to come back to that as well, so that's what we're going to do after lunch. But what does that mean? So we know that it's going to make us wise. We know it's got something to do with something to do with leadership or rule or government or something. It's got something to do with the words. It starts with the fear of the Lord. But who's it for? So who needs this kind of wisdom? And obviously that's going to be helpful because it tells us what kind of wisdom we're talking about, and we're talking about who it's for. So I'm going to make you do a bit of work now. And look at 1 verse 1. You've got a little title there, so the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. I want you to use your kind of skimming tool. So this is where you kind of flip the pages and just look. Obviously, I guess by this point, you've realized that the bold subheadings in your Bible were added by the editors of the ESV or the NIV or whichever translation you're using. Hopefully you're using the King James, because then I guess they probably don't have them. But in the ESV or the NIV, and there you are, you've got these bold sort of subheadings. So forget about those. But as you skim through Proverbs, there are actually some titles that are part of the text, as in just part of the text of the book, as it was given. See if you can find them. So other ones like 1 verse 1, and make a note of them. And then just think, well, what do those titles suggest about the book? And then I've suggested skimming through the opening chapters and looking for references to my son, and what that might make you think about who the book's for. And then maybe, if you've got time, to look a bit more closely at some other passages and just think a bit more about what it's for. Okay, so over to you. Do a bit of work. I'll ask you to share your findings in a minute. Okay. Go on, John. I am here. That's right. I could even, if there's a little pen here, I could even underline things. Here, look at this, retrospectively. Great, okay. Let's start. So let's start with this one. So what titles did you find? You got 1 verse 1. What other ones did you find in the book? Fear. 10 verse 1. Oh. Oh yeah, no thanks. What's happened? It's all gone wrong now. This is my fault. Uh, 10 verse 1, which says... Great, very good. Okay, what else?
30 verse 1.
Which says...
The words of Agar, son of Jacob, the oracle.
Yeah, very good. So 30 verse 1, 10 verse 1. So we've got 1 verse 1, 10 verse 1, 30 verse 1. Any more?
31 verse 1, the words of King Lemuel.
Very good. Okay. That's right, which is quite striking, actually. We'll flip back to that in a minute. So 31 verse 1, 30 verse 1, 10 verse 1, 1 verse 1. Okay, we've divided the book into at least 4 sections. 25 verse 1, which says... Good, which the men of Hezekiah collected. That's amazing.
22:17, the words of wise.
Yeah, good. Okay, so it's slightly tricky. Oh, thank you so much. That's what we've got. Got 1 verse 1. Oh, now this is not working. Here we go. 1 verse 1. We've got 10 verse 1. And then you're saying 22 verse 16, which doesn't necessarily jump out as being a title straight away, but you have to kind of read a couple of verses, don't you? So, and you're right. I mean, you're absolutely right. So 2017, that's right, isn't it? Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to my knowledge, for it will be pleasant if you keep them within you, if all of them are ready on your lips, that your trust may be in the Lord. I've made known them to you today, even to you. Have I not written for you 30 sayings of counsel and knowledge, to make you know what is right and true, that you may give a true answer to those who sent you? And then it turns out there are then 30 sayings. I was like, that is a little introduction to the next 30 sayings. And then what do we have? We had 31 verse 1. We had 30 verse 1, we had 25 verse 1, and one more, which also helps you to think that maybe that was a title, because you get more words of the wise. So towards these also are sayings of the wise. And I guess that gives you a kind of chapters 1 to 9, and chapters 10 to 22 and chapter 22 to 24a, and then 24b, and 25 to 29, and chapter 30 and chapter 31 as these kind of 7 sections in the book of Proverbs. That's right. Good. So these titles are helpful, aren't they? Any thoughts on just those titles, what they tell you about kind of, any thoughts on who it's for, what it is, that sort of thing? Any thoughts?
Collections of Proverbs.
They are collections of Proverbs. It's great. Pick the low-hanging fruits. That's right, yeah. Good. Other thoughts?
There seems to be a lot about reading and ruling wisely.
Yes, we've got at least, exactly, we've got at least what? We've got at least David, Solomon, King, Solomon, Hezekiah, and Lemuel. We've got at least kind of 4 titles out of the 7 connected with kingship in some sort of a way. That's right. Yeah, definitely, that's true. Yeah, good. Any other thoughts? Being told off by his mother. Yes, right. That's the apex, isn't it? You've really made it in life when your mum is telling you off. That's right. Yeah, that's right. There is some sort of progression. And you can approach that from a couple of different directions. So some people who've written scholarship stuff on Proverbs think that there's a very clear progression in terms of the kind of the age and stage of the person who's being addressed by the book. I think I've toyed with that and thought about it and argued for it at some points. And I think I'm sort of persuaded by the crit of that. Actually, I think the sort of the thing that says maybe the progression is not quite like that. I think I've been persuaded that maybe that's right. But we'll think about that. Actually, there's another thing. If you go David, Solomon, Hezekiah, what other kind of progression is there? It's testing your Old Testament trivia. In what order? Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? So David, Solomon, Hezekiah, that is an order of kingship. We'll think about that a bit more later on. And then chapters 1 to 9, we had lots of stuff about sons. Who's the dad, if it's to my son, in chapters 1 to 9? Yeah, why do you say that? So the king was the answer. Yeah, great. So the setting is that the king it's either David addressing Solomon or Solomon addressing a son. I don't know, let's say Rehoboam or something. So the setting feels kind of princely or something as you're going through. Okay. And now alongside that, hopefully you notice that there's various ways in which there's an invitation to the simple. So Proverbs is kind of for people who are simple, who want to grow in understanding and wisdom. Proverbs is for sons, and that's this kind of simple, uncontroversial structure. Having said this is a very obvious structure, people don't quite agree about whether this is a sort of a structure like, John's Gospel has a structure, or whether this is more like, kind of now that's what I call Proverbs, volume 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So kind of people are a little bit less clear on whether this is a kind of a design, or whether it's just kind of a set of 7 collections. I'm going to come down and tell you, I think the design version is the right one. There's a shape to the book, as we kind of noticed this, that actually, having said that there's a sort of a father-son thing going on, and the word that scholars used to describe that is like an instruction. So when you have parents addressing my son, they call that like an instruction. And basically you get instructions in chapters 1 to 9, and you get instruction kind of comes back in chapters 22 to 24, and you get instruction in chapter 31. And so you kind of have this parents to son, mother to son at the end in chapter 31, and that sort of seems to kind of, go around the book. And then in between, you basically have these two big collections of one-liners. And so basically all the one-liners come in chapter 10 through 22, the Proverbs of Solomon, and then 25 to 29, more Proverbs of Solomon, these kind of two collections. And that, again, that begins to look a little bit like it's a kind of a deliberate shape, doesn't it? You're going to go to that and go, okay, so basically you've got a whole load of one-liners that have been kind of put on this backbone of a parent addressing their son as you go through the book, and something like that. And here's the obvious point. Proverbs is for sons. Okay, so let's go back up here. I'm going to write this in. A book to make who wise? A book to make sons wise. Everyone sort of happy so far? Now you might be thinking, hang on a second, what if I'm a daughter? Well, hold fire. Okay, so then the question is, what sort of a son are we talking about? And so what are the options? It's like, if we're talking about sons, what kind of an option are we going for? Well, one option is that by son, we basically just mean kind of, Israelite son, sort of a run-of-the-mill child in an Israelite home, or something like that. And there's all kinds of reasons to think that that could be true. So let's start with the imagery. Have a look at, so again, in your pairs, just have a look at Proverbs chapters 4, 6, and 7. So I've got these three bits here. And compare them with these passages from Deuteronomy. And what I want to do is basically notice the similarities in terms of the imagery. And then what might that make us think about what sort of father-son relationship is in view in the book of Proverbs, okay? And what might that mean for the target audience? Okay, over to you. Have a look. Now, hopefully, what you've begun to notice is that there's at least two levels of connection, maybe three, maybe four. Let's go for four, 3, 2, I don't know, a number of connections between Proverbs and Deuteronomy. So to begin with, both Proverbs and Deuteronomy talk about wisdom, right? So have you noticed that wisdom and foolishness are Deuteronomy categories? And that's going to be important. Again, one of the mistakes that people make when they're trying to teach a book like Proverbs is they say, well, Proverbs is about wisdom, and therefore the right New Testament intertext is anything that talks about wisdom. So like 1 Corinthians chapter 1 or something, Colossians, anything that talks about wisdom, hyperlinked to Proverbs. But the truth is that the whole Bible has a lot to say about wisdom, as it turns out, and foolishness. And kind of ground zero is Genesis chapter 3, for talking about wisdom and folly, as it turns out. And actually, they're quite big categories in the book of Deuteronomy. To say it's a hyperlink back to Proverbs is just slightly clumsy, because there's a whole lot of wisdom and folly, as it turns out, as you're reading through the Old Testament. So wisdom and folly, commandments, right? So there's a lot about commandments and laws and instruction in Proverbs. But of course, if you ask the question, well, which instruction, which law, which commandment? Well, the obvious answer in the Old Testament is the law, the commandment, the instruction. And then, just in case you were wondering about that, it turns out that the whole parent thing is really important to Deuteronomy too. And that's the idea that Israel itself is a son with a father instructing it, but also the idea that within Israelite families, that parents teaching their children which way to go is a really important thing. And then hopefully you notice that the way, the journey, is a really key idea in both Proverbs. So in Michael V. Fox's commentary on Proverbs, Michael V. Fox, not Michael J. Fox, sadly, but in his commentary on Proverbs, he says that wisdom is a path is the ground metaphor for the book of Proverbs. And that's true, as in, like, if you read through chapters 1 to 9. At one point, I happen to know some Hebrew, and when I was studying chapters 1 to 9 a bit more closely, I decided to learn all of the Hebrew vocab that comes up in chapters 1 to 9 of Proverbs. And what that essentially means is you spend a lot of time learning different Hebrew words for path, as like wagon track, byway, sheep trail, like all the different Hebrew words for path. Because it turns out it's true, as in wisdom is a path, is kind of a grand metaphor in Proverbs, chapters 1 to 9, and in Deuteronomy, right? As in that the law is a way, and that you don't turn aside to it from it to the right or to the left, but you walk straight in it. That's the Deuteronomy thoughts. And then also, did you notice the stuff about like binding it writing on the tablet on your hearts, or binding it? And again, that comes from Deuteronomy, doesn't it? This idea that the law is something that you might have as a frontlet on your eyes, or that you might bind around your fingers, or you might write on the tablet of your heart. And all that imagery comes up in Proverbs as you're reading it through. And that kind of makes you think, okay, so we're in Deuteronomy world. There's no doubt that whoever first said chapters 1 to 9 of Proverbs had read and was thinking of Deuteronomy as they said it. No doubt. It's like a very, very strong allusions to Deuteronomy. Okay, well, makes me think, okay, so the son is like an Israelite son, just a general Israelite, the kind of son or daughter, I suppose, in an Israelite home who needs to be brought up in the knowledge of God's commandment and walking in his ways. And then there's some kind of structural thing that sort of fits with that. And so Deuteronomy, there's better ways to talk about the structure of Deuteronomy, but in a kind of slightly rough and ready way. Deuteronomy, you begin with this big exhortation to hear and obey at the start of the book. And then you have the commandments, and basically Moses preaches through the law in chapters 12 to 28. And then you end the book of Deuteronomy with this kind of big eschatological conclusion where Moses looks forward to the future and tells you what's going to happen in days to come and all of that sort of thing. And it turns out that actually Proverbs kind of goes the same way, that you have chapters 1 to 9, this big exhortation, chapters 1 to 9, the bit we all find easy, those opening 9 chapters. And then you have the Proverbs in chapters 10 through 29, and then the book ends with this kind of much more sort of eschatological conclusion, as it turns out in chapters 30 and 31. And you kind of go, it even looks like it might have been patterned on the book of Deuteronomy. I don't know, what do you call that? A Deuteronomy, I suppose you might say. What do you call a Deuteronomy? As Deuteronomy means second, so how do you repeat a repeat? Yeah, well, anyway, there we go. And then the context that Deuteronomy has a lot to say about wisdom and folly, that wisdom is all about obeying the Lord and inheriting the land, and it's in contrast to the foolishness and the idolatry of the nations. And so you might think, okay, well, this is all very straightforward. Proverbs is just a book about basically how to teach your children to be obedient, law-abiding, wise, well-instructed, well-adjusted, homeschooled Israelites. That's what Proverbs is about. And that all feels quite straightforward. And then there's a book in the Silver Book series. If you've never got into the Silver Book series, it's a great little set, the New Studies in Biblical Theology. Some of them are better than others. None of them are terrible. As I said, it's a few series where you can kind of say, you pick any of them and it'll kind of be fine. And some of them are great. And there's a Silver Book written by Dan Estes on Proverbs chapters 1 to 9 called Hear My Son. And it's basically said, well, what does this teach us just about basically how to raise your children and just teaching and pedagogy more generally. So all very straightforward. By son, we just mean Israelites. That's what Proverbs is for. But then wait, we said at the beginning that Proverbs keeps on banging on about kings, and it does. So let's flip back and just think, okay, well, what about royal sons? And we noticed already that in 1:1, 10:1, 25:1, and 31:1, 4 times through the course of the book, kings turns out to be a big deal. And at the beginning of the book, in chapter 1 and verse 3, it promises to instruct you in righteousness, justice, and equity. And then in chapter 2, you kind of get a poem which is sort of an index of what follows. And so chapter 2 kind of gives you the program for chapters 2 through 7 or 8. And it turns out that, again, that combination of words, righteousness, justice, and equity, 2 verse 9, comes up again in that index. And then our friend at the back mentioned that they love chapter 8. And when you get to Proverbs chapter 8, again, the key thing that, I'm making you do lots of flipping now, aren't I? The key thing that wisdom does is to sort of show kings how to reign, and shows rulers how to decree what is just, and by me princes rule. And that might look like a slight throwaway line, except it turns out when you read chapter 8, actually the whole point of that poem is that wisdom is what God used when God was acting as king and creating the world, and when the Lord, the king, the cosmic ruler, was kind of setting the boundaries and decreeing and kind of ruling where the sea was allowed to go. He did all of that. God is a wise king in creation, and also kings who rule well, rule with wisdom. So it turns out that's quite a big thing in chapter 8. And then there's kind of a plot in the book. So this is a quote that I found on a blog. I put here because it says something I think comes from Peter Lightheart, who's been quoted on the Gospel Coalition. Peter Lightheart says many, many, many things, and some of them are right. Here's the first one. In the first 8 chapters of Proverbs, 2 women are presented, Dame Folly and Lady Wisdom. The prince, Solomon's sons, this is our guys at the front. Who's the son? Well, if we're talking about Solomon or David at the beginning, Solomon's son must decide which he will embrace as his bride. Will he marry Dame Folly or will he marry Lady Wisdom? At the end of the book, we learn that the prince has resisted the temptations of Dame Folly. Proverbs 31 describes the superhuman labors of the excellent wife, and we know that the prince has chosen well, for he's made Lady Wisdom his queen. Now, let me just do a little bit of quick correcting on this. First 9 chapters of Proverbs, 2 women presented, Dame Folly, the prince, someone else's son, must decide which he'll embrace. And then by the end, what about chapter 30? But okay, with those general corrections in place, very helpful paragraph, the book tells the story of how a callow young prince at the beginning needs to choose between 2 consorts, wisdom and folly. And then you have the Proverbs in the middle, and at the end you get this king who has made wisdom his wife in chapter 31. And again, all of that makes you think, okay, hang on a second. I thought you just told me it's for Israelite sons, but now you're telling me it's for kings. Which one is it? Well, John Gemmell and I were speaking this morning about the very great wisdom of having 2 cakes, because then you can actually have your cake and eat it. Now, the problem with having your cake and eat it is you do need to have 2 cakes, as you can't have your cake and eat it if you've only got 1 cake. But, well, unless it's this cake. Okay, so the Proverbs cake. And I think in Proverbs it's helpful to see that it is kind of both of these things at the same time. So on the one hand, it's a royal Deuteronomy. We said that it's got the same structure as the book of Deuteronomy, and it has all this imagery that's drawn from Deuteronomy. But of course, the whole point of the book of Proverbs is it's not actually Deuteronomy, right? It's Proverbs. And what's the difference between Proverbs and Deuteronomy? Well, one difference is that it's Proverbs, and that they're in Proverbs. But another difference is that it's from the king. This is kind of David and Solomon and Hezekiah. This is kind of what kings do when they have actually meditated on Deuteronomy and understood it. So not Deuteronomy, but a kind of a royal Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy repackaged as wisdom by the king, something like that. So on the one hand, it's a royal Deuteronomy. And if you know Deuteronomy, you'll know that the picture in Deuteronomy chapter 17 of the king in Israel is as a man like other Israelites, so one of your brothers, not a kind of a special or different class person, but just a normal Israelite whose job is to meditate on the law day and night, so that they've kind of internalized it. And so they're made wise and they're able to rule because of the law. And I guess from one angle, I suppose what you're saying is, well, Proverbs is kind of that book. What happens if you get a king to meditate on the law day and night, and they begin to internalize it? What do you have? But of course, that means that it is a book for Israelites. And the Israelite king, like I said, was an ideal Israelite. And in chapters 1 to 9, you have this curious thing that happens as you read on, where most of the time it's addressing my son, one son, but then every so often you get an address to kind of plural sons. It starts right at the beginning, actually, that right at the start you have this invitation not just to any sons, but to the wise and to the youth and to the simple. And then you get kind of moments like chapter 4 and verse 1, hear, O sons of fathers' instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insights. Or again, I think something similar comes up in chapter 5, so verse 7. And now, O sons, listen to me, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. And so it's not just a royal father addressing his prince son, but it's kind of a royal father addressing his prince son and then kind of broadening it out to the room and saying, and the rest of you all, listen to what I have to say. And I guess you can imagine Proverbs as being a bit like the internalization of the law. So on the one hand, it is a book for Israelites, and let's imagine that you're trying to raise a godly son or daughter at some point in the history of Israel. We'll come back to that in a second. Proverbs has lots to say about that. But on the other hand, it really is a book about rule. Now, again, that shouldn't totally surprise us. Like, what is a human being in the story of the Bible? And the answer is, well, a human being is kind of a king or a queen, as in C.S. Lewis was right about that, that the sons and daughters of Adam are kings and queens. That's just Genesis chapter 1, isn't it? That human beings are created to have dominion and to rule over the world that God has made. And of course, the kings of Israel were designed to be like new humans who did what humanity was meant to do right in the first place. And so having said that it's kind of a general book, that doesn't mean that it's not a kind of a rule book or a leadership book. It's kind of both together. I'm going to have my cake and eat it, I think, on this one. I don't know if there's going to be cake in the coffee break, but if there is, I'm going to take 2. Am I allowed to do that? I'll give one of them away. I actually ate a sort of an outlandish amount of black pudding and haggis at breakfast time. So, welcome to Scotland. It's really a book about rule. And actually, that's going to kind of help us to think through what we're kind of learning. So, what sort of a curriculum is it as you're reading it? Well, I guess you can approach it from 2 angles and say, well, look, it's a curriculum to teach you to grow up wise as one of God's people and to walk as a son of the covenant. And it's a book that is there to teach you to lead or to rule, a book to train the king, and both of those things at the same time. And there's one last thing I want to say before this break, which I hinted at in the exposition this morning, which is that one more way to say the same thing is that it's kind of a book about ministry and about how not to wreck your ministry. In other words, the things that wreck Israelite lives, I'll say a bit more about this in the next session, and the things that brought down the kingdom of Israel are the same things that wreck churches. If you want to do a good job of leading a church, you need to do better than the kings of Israel at leading their nation and Israelite fathers at leading their families. If it's a book about families, about households, and about lives, and about the kingdom, it's a book about ministry. And I think it's going to be really helpful for us. Proverbs is a book about how not to wreck your life and also how not to wreck your ministry. It's a book for sons. Good, okay, let me pause there. We have a cup of coffee, it's all right. Hand over to you. Great.